Vintage Adventure Reels. My name is Emma and I am here with Elliot, veteran journalist, author, adventurer, and my dad. And we're here to have a deep dive into some amazing footage that my father and his friend captured on their adventures around the world in, what year was it?
1966 to 1968.
Amazing. So welcome, Pappy. How are you today?
I'm well, thanks. I hope my fading memory can do justice to what was happening in the Australian youth scene, 60 years ago, when there was a lot of movement encouraged for young people to gain overseas experience and being given a year's leave of absence from their work, or they would take the big plunge and just try and get work, particularly in England and the British Isles, where Australians were well received as workers. So that was the motivation for it.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about your context, just to remind us about what you were doing at that stage, where you were working, what life was like, and what was the really big motivation for you and your friend Graham to take this adventure?
Well, I grew up in a rural Australian town in the state of Queensland, very close to the tropics. So one of the major industries was sugarcane plantations. We had a rum distillery, 4 or 5 sugar mills. It was the basis of the local economy in Bundaberg. And I worked at the local newspaper. I'd done a 4-year cadetship in journalism, and by that time I was a graded journalist, pretty experienced, qualified, that I could gain work at any of the metropolitan daily newspapers in Australia. But I was quite comfortable in the township. We were on the edge of the Great Barrier Reef, and I took up skin diving very early, at the age of about 14 or 15. One of my schoolmates, I was very friendly with, Graham Brewer. He'd come up through the ranks of the sugar technologist, who was an industrial chemist in the sugar mills, and he was second in charge with the Bundaberg rum distillery. And so we got to that stage where we were hearing stories from former schoolmates, young men and women who'd headed off overseas. At that time, we were too old for the Vietnam National Service call-up, but we had mates who'd joined the regular army, and we had younger mates who'd been conscripted, and they were having overseas travel of a different sort, in jungle fighting in Vietnam, and all the ramifications that was producing. So we were fortunate that we didn't have to carry a rifle and go off to a war like our fathers and uncles did, and our grandfathers, and that was sort of tragically one way that young Australian men saw the rest of the world, was going off and fighting wars, sometimes for other causes.
You mentioned before in the introduction that there was this sort of historical context of young Australians even being encouraged by their employers. What did that look like? What was that about?
It was to get a better view of the world, I think, because we were a great trading nation, and we were also a nation a maritime nation that was both served and with goods and services from overseas, and also with exports. So travelling by sea was the adventurous way to go. Travelling by air, as we travel today, was unheard of. The cost was so high, That was for, the political and commercial elite to travel that way. So there was also the attraction of, like cruise ships today. There was something similar on offer. But for instance, the industry that I was in, our local newspaper, back in those days, newspapers were produced with a process of producing hot metal type, and it was called, you had a hard copy and hot metal, and there were 5 different printing trades back then which no longer exist. In that period, the Barnabas Newsmail was looking at converting to a coal type system, which is what basically happens nowadays. And it was quite innovative, and the managing director, Roy Theodore, who was a mentor of mine, said, well, if you're thinking of going overseas, we can give you a leave of absence for a year. So you come back with no loss of the time that you've had in terms of long service leave. So it's like an extended sabbatical, normally for a year. And I was sort of briefed to have a look and visit newspaper productions with the new technology. And it's fascinating that we found that in both our industries, we were the leading technologies in Australia, or we were the ones prepared to look at it and do it. In England, you'd get beaten up by the printers union if you suggested that there should be a change to coal type. So they were resisting, they were traditionalists. And the same thing with Graham. New technology for the distilling industry just wasn't being considered.
What's your take on why that might be? Is it because we were more still in that pioneering spirit of being so far away from the mother country, and maybe breaking with some of those traditions?
Yeah, breaking with tradition, I think. And Australians had been shown to be innovative, particularly in lots of agricultural areas, and we had the CSIRO, which was a national organisation to advance science and technology. So yes, we were more inclined to, these Australians saying have a go, and that meant adapting to change. Whereas a lot of the culture, particularly in Britain, was based on tradition, custom and practice, as they called it.
What's already been established.
Yes, yeah. And they've done a great job of preserving all that. But the one country in Europe that impressed about being innovative was Germany. And of course it was reinventing itself, after the Second World War, so it was being very innovative. I only found one newspaper that was to an advanced stage with the new printing technology, and that was in Norway,
right.
A place called Mo i Rana. We got interviewed there as they wanted to talk to us. They heard that there were Australians staying at the youth hostel, and they sent an English-speaking journo down because the Scandinavians were very interested in Vietnam, what was happening in Vietnam, and who was supporting the Americans and who weren't. So it wasn't the normal interview about kangaroos and surfboards or the outback. They wanted some political comment, which was interesting.
So what kind of, from a cost perspective, your employers were guaranteeing that you could come back to your positions, but you obviously would have had to have saved your pennies to be able to go on this kind of adventure. What did you do for that, and how expensive was it?
Well, the motivation started when I was 22. I can remember that. there were, I'm going to. Back then, 21 years was the official age of adulthood, right? So you could make your own decisions, and you could vote, and you could drink in a hotel officially. But it wasn't until I turned 25 before I was in a position to have saved up enough money to do it. Graham and I had sort of committed, among all our friends, he and I. We weren't really. We both had good mates, but the idea was when you were travelling overseas, particularly as Australian, you took a mate. So the girls took a girlfriend, the blokes travelled with another bloke. That was sort of a hangover from the early days in Australia, where the convicts and the early settlers paired off with a mate just to survive.
Right.
And in both world wars, they did that sort of thing. So you stuck together. So that was interesting. You had to have some common interest, but then you had to share. For instance, I went and did things and saw things that Graham wanted to see, and I found them quite interesting, but I wasn't particularly concerned about it originally. So, so there was a saving up period, and I had a short wheelbase Land Rover. We were into spearfishing and hunting and stuff, and outdoors canoeing. So I tarted it up and sold it, but I can remember I couldn't even get the boat fare there and back with the sale of that. So there was, I sold my shotgun. I was a very keen shotgun trap shooter, competitive, and I had a beautiful Browning shotgun which I sold and parted with. And as they say, greater love hath no man that he will trade in his Browning shotgun to have enough money to travel. Various other things like that. There wasn't any overtime in those days. You just worked until the job was finished. Didn't matter how long it was.
Yeah.
But yes, so we both had enough money to get us on the go, and we had enough to keep us moving. We didn't have to take a job, say, for a year or 6 months. So we looked for casual labour, and we found it in hop farming in Kent just before we went off on another adventure, which was crossing the Atlantic in a 45-foot ocean racing boat.
Amazing, and we're going to be looking at all of this footage as we move through. So, what was the going rate for what you could live off back then? You're travelling like this. Was there a?
We read an article in one of the travel books that if you were very frugal, you could travel and live on $1 US a day in Europe.
Amazing.
And in some parts of the world cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
I think we each had about $200, the equivalent of 200. Decimal currency happened just as we were leaving.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we had about $200 each in a bank account that we could access over there. And the other economies were an organisation called Youth Hostels. They were worldwide, YHA Australia. And the only thing there was that in some of you had to actually be on foot. You had to walk in to the hostel. You had to backpack, walk into the hostel. You couldn't go by public transport. We cheated a little bit in Ireland in that we hired a car when we eventually got to Ireland. And so you'd park the car in town somewhere and you'd backpack it to the hostel. They used to turn a bit of a blind eye to it, particularly if you're from overseas. What they were trying to stop was youth hostels being a cheap form of accommodation for itinerant nationals who were just working or moving or around, so it had to be this youth exchange worldwide.
Right. And so I will have put in a bit of footage as you were describing, you know, the lifestyle that you and Graham were having back in Bundaberg just before you embarked spearfishing, a lot of time skin diving and fishing and frolicking around in the Australian bush. But had you, prior to this adventure, had you had much experience of travelling, say, to the larger metropolitan cities of Australia even?
I had one quick trip when I was 14 to Sydney to stay with an uncle and aunt and visited Bondi Beach. I don't think Graham had been south of the New South Wales border, and the biggest city we would have been was Brisbane, which was a 5-hour drive in my little Morrisette utility from Bundaberg to. And I used to go to Brisbane probably more often than Graham because I had mates who'd moved down there and journalist mates who worked at the Courier Mail or the Telegraph, and we used to stay with them. So the only other adventurous things that we'd done, I think, was that we'd probably gone as far north as the Whitsunday Islands for a holiday. That was the big, you know, the South Mole Island was where the younger people went. But the economy was so buoyant, the sugar industry was doing well right across Australia. When you young people leaving school or the university could virtually decide what career they wanted, there'd be a job there if they were interested, pretty much for life. So the pays were good, and young people, fashions were changing. We'd sneak into cabarets before, and our version of cabarets, which was a live band in a beer garden in a local pub, underage. The police used to turn a bit of a blind eye if you behaved yourself, you were well dressed, you didn't get into strife. So you could get in 19, 20 maybe,